Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another monitor review. In this one, my friends, we're going to be taking a look at the Titan Army C32C1S. This is a 32-inch 1440p 240Hz curved display with a VA panel. It's priced at $340 although you can get it on sale very often. Let's start by talking about the pixel density. I usually say that the 27-inch 1440p monitor is the sweet spot. It has a pretty high PPI of 109 pixels per inch, and a 32-inch monitor, being much bigger, of course, will have a lower PPI. In this case, it's 93 pixels per inch. So it's not going to be as sharp as a 27-inch 1440p monitor, and it's going to be closer in terms of pixel density to a 1080p 24.5-inch display, which is pretty much the most utilized screen size at 1080p resolution out there. So basically, if you have a 1080p display at 24.5 inches, upgrading to a 32-inch 1440p display will just be a very big size increase. And that's quite nice. You know, I think the size difference is going to make things a lot more immersive in games. I just wish, once again, that the PPI was a bit bigger, but that's personal preference, of course. I myself have utilized a 32-inch monitor for a couple of years back in 2020, all the way up to 2022, and it was a 1440p display as well. I was perfectly fine playing my games on it, but of course, moving to 4K at 32 inches was a huge increase in sharpness and detail, and now I can't really go back. But it still provided a great viewing experience, and of course a 4K monitor of this size and high refresh rate is going to be a lot more expensive. Let's talk colors now. And I used this Calibrite tool to measure the color gamut of the display, and I recorded 95% sRGB, 80% of Adobe RGB, and 80% DCI-P3 color gamut. These values were a bit below what I was expecting because looking at the specs of this monitor in Titan Army's website, it shows 99% sRGB, so it's a little bit below in reality, 80% Adobe RGB, which is actually the same as I got, and 85% of DCI-P3 instead of the 80% that we got. So this translates into a good gaming experience, you know. I can't really tell a difference between 99 and 95% sRGB. Colors are still vibrant and they pop, you know, but if you want to do some professional color work, this is not the monitor for you. By the way, out of the box, I noticed it came with a very warm color temperature, and upon going into the on-screen display settings, I noticed it was set to warm out of the box, and setting it to normal actually made it look pretty accurate. Speaking of, out of the box, it also seems like there was no adjustment needed in terms of RGB colors, and that's pretty nice. There's no need to adjust those settings in particular, but this differs from monitor to monitor. Moving on to the brightness, I recorded a peak brightness of 358 nits, which is a little bit over the advertised number of 350 nits, but it's pretty much the same thing. But that results in a pretty nice viewing experience. I actually found myself lowering the brightness of the monitor when playing games on it because I don't want to burn my eyes. Some people will find that this is a bit too low brightness for them, but for my tastes, it's perfectly fine, unless you have a window facing your monitor. I feel like the brightness is a bit more important in laptops because you take them around with you, you might actually look at them in direct sunlight, and here it works just fine. 350 nits is okay. But what about minimum brightness? A lot of you ask me about it, and I recorded 29 nits of minimum brightness, which is actually the same as the previous Titan Army monitor that I tested, and this results in a pretty dim image. The C32C1S also supports HDR 400 specification, so if you're interested in that, go ahead, although I don't recommend it because I feel like it looks worse with HDR than SDR, so I never really utilize it. Unless the monitors have like HDR 1000 specification, then it starts looking pretty good, but yeah. It's something that it supports, but it's not really the best HDR. Contrast is next, and here is where a VA panel actually shines. With a 3000:1 contrast ratio, it beats any IPS in the market, which usually score around 1000:1, and this means you get a darker black color in your picture, which is always great. Obviously, this isn't industry leading like the OLEDs, for example, but this monitor is actually pretty good for a non-OLED display. Speaking of darkness, let's test the Backlight Bleed. And since this is a curved monitor, it has quite a bit of it. Although what you're seeing here is exaggerated on camera compared to the naked eye, because to properly show it to you, I needed to slow down the shutter speed. But while playing games, it's only noticeable in very, very dark scenes and only if you look for it. So I don't really find it distracting at all, and since it's a VA panel, the Backlight Bleed is also a bit less noticeable than it would otherwise be on an IPS display. So another plus for the VA over there. Now, where the VA technology has some issues and it doesn't win usually over the IPS displays is in response times. And I tested the response times with the NVIDIA LDAT sensor at 240Hz, 120Hz, and 60Hz with all of the overdrive settings enabled or disabled. That is off, level 1, level 2, level 3, and top speed. In this table, you can see all of that information put together, the average and maximum response times in milliseconds, and the overshoot levels, which is inverse ghosting. Note that for perfect transitions at 240Hz, you need the response time to be at less than 4.17 milliseconds. At 120Hz, you need it to be at less than 8.33 milliseconds. And at 60Hz, you need it to be at less than 16.67 milliseconds. Compared to the IPS displays that I've tested, this definitely falls short, but it's far from a bad VA panel. At 240Hz and with overdrive set to off level 1 and level 2, we often see ghosting in most of the transitions, which isn't ideal. We start seeing good average response times with overdrive level 3, although with a little bit of overshoot, which I still consider good because it's below 5%, so it wasn't noticeable. And in overdrive top speed, the average response time drops even more, but overshoots start to get pretty noticeable, so I wouldn't go with that. Also, notice that the maximum response times between all of the overdrive settings here are very high. That's because of the nature of VA. In gray or dark gray color scenes, it will always have noticeable ghosting, but it wasn't as bad as other VA panels that I've seen, like the Samsung Odyssey G5. Moving on to 120Hz, and here the maximum response times were also bad across the board because of VA once again, but the average response times were actually pretty good, even with overdrive completely turned off. The only mode that I wouldn't recommend here is the top speed because it has a bit more overshoot, but it did pretty well at 120Hz overall. And finally, onto the 60Hz results. Here we see good average response times across the board again, and something interesting happens with overdrive level 2 and up. The maximum transitions are finally on the green, so we don't have any ghosting at 60Hz with overdrive level 2, 3, and top speed. Overshoot was also well controlled in all of these settings here at 60Hz, so absolutely no problems here. So in the end, it doesn't even... No. Copyright. In the end, I think overdrive level 3 provides the best balance between response times and overshoot at all refresh rates, and this is my recommendation. Now let's take a closer look at the on-screen display. It is controlled with 5 buttons, and I wish it was controlled by a joystick because that's much easier. Era este, não era este. At least the 5 buttons are easily accessible on the bottom of the display instead of on the back. Those are terrible, you know. And the on-screen display itself has every setting you can wish for in a monitor OSD, including the overdrive settings we just talked about, positioning, sharpness, opacity, RGB controls, and so on. And you can also enable adaptive sync here, which is AMD FreeSync, and it's NVIDIA G-Sync compatible as well. Be sure to enable this option both in the monitor as well as the NVIDIA control panel if you have an NVIDIA GPU, or VRR on AMD's Radeon settings to make sure that you get rid of that annoying screen tearing. The ports are next, and we can see that it has a couple of HDMI 2.1 ports, followed by a couple of DisplayPort 1.4 ports, a headphone jack which sounds pretty good, and the DC power connector for the internal power supply. They only include one DisplayPort cable in the box and the power cord as well, And this is everything else that comes with the monitor in the box. You can see they also include some VESA support screws, and this is VESA 75 by 75, which you will need to utilize if you like your monitor to be adjustable, because the included stand, although it's metal and it doesn't make the screen wobble much, it is only tilt adjustable. You can't adjust the height, you can't swivel, and you can't, of course, pivot. The monitor itself is made of plastic, but that's fine. Also, the stand itself has a little hole at the bottom where you can route cables through. On the front of the monitor, you have the Titan Army logo, very thin bezels on the top and the sides, and on the back of the monitor, you have a red light, which I didn't find any setting to change it to other colors, so maybe it's only red, maybe it isn't. And finally, let's go over the gaming experience, what I think about this monitor, basically the conclusion of the video. So for esports titles with that 240Hz refresh rate, it feels really smooth, although, once again, since the maximum response time transitions are so slow, sometimes there is a little bit of ghosting here and there. I noticed it mostly in the tunnel area in Counter-Strike 2, the Dust 2 map, but it wasn't too overwhelming, you know, it wasn't very noticeable. I was looking for it, so of course I noticed it, but most of the time in that particular title it worked pretty well, and I was surprised once again to see this kind of performance on a VA panel. Again, this was with the Overdrive set to level 3, which I find to be the best for this monitor, and I had a great experience in competitive shooter titles. But what about single player games? Well, most games from like 2022 and older looked pretty good. Sometimes a little bit too soft because of that 32-inch display size with 1440p resolution and that PPI mostly. It doesn't look as sharp as a 27-inch display with 1440p resolution, or the last monitor that I reviewed from Titan Army, which was 24.5 inches at 1440p. Very crispy indeed. I like it. So some games were a little bit softer than I'd like for example Red Dead Redemption 2. Yeah, the TAA implementation on that game is pretty terrible, and coupled with a low PPI, it wasn't the best experience there, but it was still very immersive, of course, with that curve, with that display size as well, and I could still enjoy the game absolutely fine. It's just that I've been spoiled by the 4K screens and the higher pixel density displays. But for example, Forza Horizon 5 looked very good and actually super crispy. To my surprise, it was one of the most crispy games that I've seen here in this monitor, and it was an overall very beautiful and great experience. Now, what about darker games like Cyberpunk 2077 running in Night City during nighttime? Honestly, I was expecting to see some ghosting there because it's a darker scene, you know, but I couldn't really spot it. When I was playing the game, I didn't notice that whatsoever, and I was very surprised by it because at one point I was trying to look for a ghosting and it was hard to find an area where I saw some ghosting. So this VA panel, once again, is actually one of the better VAs that I have seen so far. Now, the main problem that I have with this size and this PPI basically is in newer titles when you need to utilize frame generation, which softens the image a little bit, and it also introduces a bit of ghosting sometimes and artifacting, as well as TAA and terrible implementations of TAA from newer games. Like Stalker 2, for example, looked absolutely awful. I was using DLAA plus frame generation to achieve a smooth frame rate because otherwise it wouldn't be smooth at all because this game's terribly optimized, you know? And I saw a ton of artifacting, a ton of blurry visuals. It's not mainly because of the monitor, but having a higher PPI surely helps in those situations. But at the same time, a lot of people are playing once again at 1080p 24.5 inches with a slightly lower PPI than this, and they're perfectly fine with that experience. It's probably a question of I've been spoiled heavily. Also by their own 24.5-inch 240Hz 1440p display, which has a much higher PPI. But yeah, overall, it isn't a bad-looking monitor. It's probably not for everyone. I've seen some comments of people in other videos telling me that they hate 1440p at 32 inches. Others say that they love it. I myself think it's fine, and if you're looking for a big monitor, immersive experiences and so on, especially with that curve, it's a nice display. Although it could come down a bit in price for sure. And if it was up to me, I'd grab something IPS instead of VA because the response times will be much better and you don't have problems with ghosting, at least with fast IPS monitors these days. But that's been it for the C32C1S Titan Army monitor. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you are interested in buying it. I'll leave a link down below in the description. There are also some discount codes down there. And I'll catch you in the next one very soon. As always, love you all. Bye-bye. And have a great Christmas.